Fantastic. Okay, welcome back to Linux Conference Australia 2012 afternoon session. We have got two speakers on the topic today, Women in Open Technology and Culture Worldwide. The speakers are Valerie. There, that's right. Valerie is Executive Director and co-founder of the ADA Initiative, a non-profit dedicated to increasing the participation of women in open technology and culture. Has over a decade experience in working in the open source community as well as a Linux kernel developer, and never imagined that she would have a reason to read the US-Australia tax treaty. So, taxation law is a wonderful thing. The other speaker in this slot is Mary Gardner. Mary Gardner is an open source developer, computer science graduate student and women in open source advocate with over 10 years experience. Has written several 100,000 words in support of women in open source, while serving in leadership positions in several women in open source organisations. This includes founding the first and largest women in open source organisation in Australia, Aussie Chicks, and in 2011 expanded through Oceania under the name of OWOOT. Is that right? Yes, good. She's also founded Linux Chicks, now called Haxon, at Mini Conference Series, a prominent open source community member, having served as a committee member of the Sydney Linux Users Group, a council member of Linux Australia, and as program chair for Linux.conf.au. Please, everybody, give Valerie and Mary a warm welcome.
Okay. So today we're going to be talking about women in open technology and culture in a survey kind of sense, introducing you to women in open tech and culture groups worldwide, and also some thoughts about where they're headed in the future. So we're not actually planning on talking much about the ADA initiative in this talk, but more about other initiatives worldwide and yeah, their direction.
Did I do it? No, wait, okay. Unfamiliar clicker.
So you just got a pretty extensive introduction to who we are. The ADA Initiative is a non-profit that was founded, it was originally announced at LCA 2011 actually, and it was incorporated in March 2011, so we're not quite a year old yet. We currently work 1.5 time, as in Val is the one and I'm the half. Supporting women in open technology and culture, in particular doing the kind of work, documentation, event organizing, networking, centralizing things that is less volunteer work and that is better supported by full-time advocates. We're also hoping that by having a formal non-profit, we help solve the problem of burnout. This area is really prone to people doing a couple of years of really hard slog in their bedroom after the hours of 9, and then a couple of years later saying, to hell with it, I'm going back to coding, that was easy.
And rage quitting, yeah.
Yeah.
Mary and I know this personally.
So that's the ADA initiative. We'll talk a little bit more about it at the end, but from now we'll continue with our survey.
See. Unfamiliar clicker, F5.
What?
Okay. All right. So we had to invent the term open technology and culture. We were starting this and we realized that open source by itself wasn't big enough to cover what we wanted to do. Sort of like open source is a little bit like the default, becoming the default for software. So, for example, I did a lot of work on Linux, which is open source, which was then used by a bunch of banks to steal all of our money. So I felt like we felt like open source wasn't a large enough topic. So what we mean by open technologies, culture is including open source software, but things like Wikipedia, all forms of wikis, open data, anything to do with the open web, trying to keep the technology open to people, to everyday people like us, so that we can control it. It also includes cultural sorts of things like remix culture, fan fiction, Even something like Pride and Prejudice and Zombies falls under this area. So video remixing is another topic. In some of these areas, women are already the majority. So one of the great things about covering these areas is that we get to learn from areas that already have more women and have successfully attracted women and have them running things.
So the obvious initial question is why support women? And to some people that's a live question. And actually we did talk about it a bit. It's worth talking about whenever you found one of these groups supporting women in a technology field or in a broader cultural field. So the original answer that Valerie said is that when she originally got involved in open source, she was really sold on having, to put it bluntly, having access to power. That open source and open culture are building some of the great physical and intellectual resources of the future, like the internet and like Wikipedia. And that in many of these fields, women's participation is incredibly low. And so women are not sharing equally in the ability to build and profit, not necessarily even in the financial sense, although that as well, but profit from helping build some of the tools we're using to build a better society.
It's one of our goals is specifically we want women to be in charge. We want women to be designing things. We want women to be making decisions. So this is not a group to help women to implement the spec drawn up by a man. It's all about the person who makes the tools and understands the tools, controls the results.
So we're going to identify here several types of women's groups. We're talking about groups in this section of the talk, groups that already exist, of which there are now quite a few. And we're not arguing, in fact, that that's a bad thing. But we're trying to draw some common themes between them and then work out what people might want to do if they want to start a new women's group or contribute to a women's group, which of the existing initiatives is currently successful. So we're going to talk about broadly 4 types of women's groups in the open tech and culture space, sometimes crossing into technology more broadly, but we're not going to spend much time on most groups that don't identify specifically with open technology. So for example, we're not going to talk about Sisters, which is a US organization which is focused on technology broadly. So the 5 actually now, since a slide edit this morning. That's what happens when you edit your slides. 5 now. So talking about community and project-specific groups, so things like Debian Women, where there's quite a specific project, and then they pull out a women's group within that project. Groups that identify, and many groups cross some of these boundaries, groups that identify with feminist activism, where they're saying that it's not just a coincidence that that participation, particularly in open tech, of women is quite low, and even where participation is very large, as it is in some open culture fields, that women often do not have access to positions of power within those communities. So feminist activist groups in the sense that they're saying this is a problem rather than a coincidence or even a feature, as some people argue. Groups that are focused on teaching technical skills and on mentoring. Groups that are focused on simply getting women together so that they can meet each other and not feel like the only woman who has ever touched a computer. And finally, a brief mention of a few majority women projects within open source, which is an area where women are in a really noticeable numeric minority. So we will visit those briefly. So
probably the first and most common women in open source groups were the ones that are formed sort of as adjuncts for particular projects. So like KDE and GNOME. Linux Chicks, Dev Chicks is a more generic web development sort of group. WikiChicks is women in Wikipedia. PyLadies is actually fairly closely affiliated with the Python Software Foundation. OWOOT is a new sort of expansion of the existing Linux community, which was always much interested in broader open source into open source in general. So it's Oceania Women of Open Technology.
So OWOOT is the group that's behind the Hexen mini-conf.
Yes,
To make it concrete for people at this conference.
Yeah, it's interesting. Linux Chicks has spawned a number of groups, and I think this counts as one of them. So what we've noticed about these groups is that while there was an initial surge of interest and excitement, and it's certainly how Mary and I got started and how we met many of the people we know now, the participation is pretty low right now. If you go and look at the mailing list archives, they tend to be pretty quiet or else have ended some time ago and nobody has fixed them again. Website hasn't been updated in a while. A lot of the leaders have left to go do other things. In some cases, they were students or unemployed, and now they have jobs or like leading the research field in their particular area, or like Mary and I have gone on to do more specifically feminist, activist kind of things. And another interesting things about these groups is that, well, you know, there's some inherent tension between, say, GNOME and KDE, or Debian and Ubuntu women, or things like that. So these groups tend not to work together, and so you end up having individual little silos of people working pretty hard to maintain their own space, but not able to work together or share their best practices with it. So.
Fairly recently, there's been sort of, I'm talking about, say, 2009 onwards, there's been more interest in groups that will specifically identify themselves as having a feminist goal. As we mentioned earlier in the talk, in this space, that's, you know, that there are a low number of women, and or that the structures of the group tend to exclude women or make them feel very spotlighted as women, and identifying that as a problem. So 3 examples of that are our own ADA initiative. The mother, if you like, of a lot of these efforts is the Geek Feminism Project. First the wiki and then the blog, which were both founded by Alex Bailey, Scud. The wiki in 2008 and the blog in 2009. Recently, the Wikimedia Foundation has embarked on a similar sort of more activist project within their own set of projects, the Gender Gap mailing list. So they have their Mind the Gap logo here. So the status of these is that they're the new hotness, I suppose.
All the cool kids are the feminist activists. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So they're largely growing and pretty active. The Geek Feminism Wiki was a really good idea and a good place to start because a lot of them are sharing terminology and resources. So there's everything on there from plain language explanation of feminist theory through to specific resources, you know, so a code of conduct that you can use for your group and suggestions on how to run mailing lists and that sort of thing.
We just passed 666 articles.
Yeah, I only personally wrote a sixth of the blog and maybe more like a quarter of the wiki. There is a move in this towards employing people on a paid basis so that it's part of their day job, which hasn't been traditionally true of the women in whatever, the women in particular project groups. So the ADA initiative, admittedly, Valerie and I decided to pay ourselves. The Wikimedia Foundation, though, is actually aggressively seeking to hand out paid internships and paid fellowships to do with diversity in Wikimedia projects.
They just awarded Sarah Sturch the first one for specifically
and
women.
in their call for fellowships this year, they very specifically said, we're looking for people to improve the diversity of Wikimedia contributors. And it's a paid 12-month fellowship. So this is the space where people are beginning to actually work on a full-time paid basis.
Also noting that things like GNOME Outreach Program for Women, a lot of that work is done on paid company time as well. So you could say like, oh, these things that are really making a significant difference, if you look behind them, you see this usually is in the background. So. Do you want to talk about the conferences? Or?
So briefly, although this particular audience knows quite a lot about them, in this space as well, there are actually beginning to be in-person events starting up. So Hakeson is the ancestor of some of them. This year it moved away from being a general technical forum for women to more specifically talking about what at this conference is called the unicorn problem, where women in open source are kind of like unicorns, as in like, whoa, did you see that unicorn?
Get a picture.
Valerie and I just on the weekend held the first ADA camp for women in mostly in East Coast Australia, but also from New Zealand, the Philippines, and Western Australia interested in women in open technology and culture. And in May this year, I think, the first Wiki Women camp associated with women from the Gender Gap mailing list will be held in, I believe, Argentina.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. We're considering a larger, eventually, not in the near future, not this year, a larger conference that's just women in open technology and culture, sized, a few hundred people, large enough that there's talks and things like that, but that's a far distant future. So there's been this really cool and successful move towards having in-person workshops to teach women specific skills. And they have a variety of different ways of making sure that women are the primary beneficiaries. There are things like men can only attend as guests, or it is really just women only. There's a bunch of different ways that it's done. But these workshops spend an evening teaching specific skills like how to use Python or how to use Ruby on Rails or various things like that. They have a certain amount of, I'll go on to this part. So they're very, very popular. There's a lot of them. They've been starting independently all over, at least all over the United States. I'm not familiar with any outside at this point. It's sort of like it was time for this to happen. It's very interesting to see that they're all popping up at once. They're starting to share best practices. A lot of them have wikis with how they put things together. Usually putting together a women's coding workshop, it's pretty easy to find a space. They have some basic guidelines like make sure the doors to the bathrooms are unlocked because usually it's after hours in somebody's workspace and a lot of times things like this aren't available. So yeah, it seems to be a growing, active, exciting movement and something to check out.
There's also, so this is sort of getting a little bit broader than open tech and culture, so we won't deal with this in great detail, but there continue to be groups that are focused on in-person socializing. So the Girl Geek dinners are fairly well known in several Australian cities. There's active groups in Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra. And at least occasional groups in Brisbane and a few other cities where it's simply a dinner for women and their guests, or women who identify as geeks and their guests. Similarly, there's Girl Geek Coffees, which is a very similar idea structured around meeting for coffee for university students, which is active at many Australian universities and some international universities. The Women Who Code group is a similar kind of social group based in, I think, US cities.
Bay Area.
Bay Area.
Girl Geek dinners are active in the US as well.
Yeah, so Girl Geek dinners are very international. They were founded in London. They and Girl Geek Coffees happen to be much more prominent in Australia than Women Who Code and Ladies Who Code and similar groups. So these tend not to be focused very much specifically on identifying as open or creating open tools or creating open resources. They do tend to have a fair bit of overlap with people who are part of groups more specifically identified with open in a way that traditional women's networking breakfasts and similar things tend not to be so strongly attended by women who are involved in open source projects. And part of that, I think, is the use of the term, or at least in the two that are active in Australia, the use of the term geek tends to be rather important because you want to not exclude people who identify with marketing and so on, but if you have an event entirely dominated with them, you don't attract women who are interested in development and project development in any sense of the word. Yeah, so these are quite popular in many cities. More spring up. They have some failure rate. Some cities will start a Girl Geek dinner and they won't find enough Girl Geeks. But broadly speaking, these are very successful initiatives and a good way to get women together who identify as builders and hackers and so forth. Probably due to requiring at least some level of identification with the term geek. And they're also quite easy to start a local chapter. And you get sort of hooked into a small publicity network when you do, which is assisting with their growth.
Right. So we wanted to talk briefly, since the title of this talk is Women in Open Technology and Culture Worldwide. These aren't specifically groups that are designed to increase for women in open technology and culture. They just happen to be completely dominated by women, which is very exciting and very interesting from the point of view of trying to figure out how to make other projects friendly to women. So Dreamwidth is a fork of the LiveJournal code, correct? That is the base of a for-profit company, right? They're for-profit, yes, called Dreamwidth. They do a lot of journaling for fan culture, fan fiction communities, find them especially welcoming. The people who develop that code base are majority women. They have a number of interesting techniques, like a designated welcome person, extremely well-documented processes, just a bunch of ways that make it really easy to get started. This symbol here is the Organization for Transformative Works. They're another fan fiction associated group developing Archive of Our Own, which is software to store people's fan fiction in a place where it won't get constant takedown notices for copyright violation or pornography or something like that.
The other thing that's important about Archive of Our Own actually is simple ownership of their own archive. So not only now is fan fiction subject to takedown notices and similar. In fact, that's not although authors do sometimes object to it, there are actually very few test cases regarding its status, its copyright status. What does tend to happen actually is that people come from the outside and monetize it. So Archive of Our Own is a response to that, where it's a non-profit that's run by a board of fans, allowing people to store their own work. So in that sense, it's very open culture. It's taking ownership of the complete means of publication, so that you don't have a LiveJournal-like situation where the host is making money from ads and from Amazon affiliate links and similar things for user-provided work. And both of these projects share a theme of not making additional money from serving up user-created content. So Dreamwidth charges you to host it, or optionally charges you to host a journal there. That's how they make money. Archive of Our Own is funded by donations, but they don't additionally advertise on top of your work. And it's very important to both projects that in both cases, primarily women users as well as developers are not sort of this profitable icing on the cake, but rather they own the cake, as it were.
Yeah. These are two excellent projects to check out if you're curious, like, what do we need to do differently? Well, they're doing it differently.
So we wanted to do a sort of an illustration of where these groups fall on various axes. So for example, you can run all the way from in-person. Over on the left here, we have Girl Geek dinners, Boston Python workshops, Rails Bridge. Those are all things that you go to and you walk through a door and you sit down. Right over at the other end, we have the Gender Gap project, which is a mailing list, although it's starting to fork in-person events. There's Geek Feminism, which is an entirely online project. In the middle, you have groups like Linux Chicks, which have a big online presence and some in-person meetings, and the Ada Initiative. We're not as in-person as we'd like to be. This week is the first week we've met since last year. But our projects span a fair range of this spectrum. So again, another spectrum that you can think of these things on, the activist versus non-activist thing, where right over on the left you have projects that really, especially, so in the case of Girl Geek Dinners, they've disclaimed an association with feminism. The founder does not like to think of it as a feminist project. Linux Chicks internally varies on that, but certainly they have no platform about doing other than bringing women together, not increasing their participation more broadly or bringing them more to central positions in the wider community. In the center, you have groups that they've identified the participation rates in these cases of women as a problem. So in that sense, they have an activist purpose, and they've specifically targeted their projects at women, often to some debate in their community. They've said, these are projects for women, we're going to spend effort on women. And then right over on the right-hand side, you have groups that very much identify with feminism and similar activist purposes. So Geek Feminism, the Gender Gap mailing list, and the Ada Initiative itself.
So another interesting axis is on whether the focus is on technical skills or technical development, or it's on providing a community to spend time with. Both are important goals, but different groups have different goals. So over here on the left, Geek Feminism is all about the community, about learning together, having people to hang out with. Girl Geek Dinner, same thing. It's a very important, powerful thing to feel like you're not alone. The first time I logged onto the Linux Chicks IRC channel, I actually cried, because I'd never met another woman who had compiled Linux or was running it or anything like that. So Linux Chicks has an interesting mix. Sometimes it has courses. There's a technical mailing list. Pretty much it depends on which mailing list you're involved in for what Linux Chicks is to you. Gender Gap is, and so, sorry, let's go to Rails Bridge. The workshops over here are very clearly teaching technical skills. They do have a community component to them, obviously. Getting in a room together with people, with other women is wonderful. But the Ada Initiative, we're interested in doing both. First Patch Week is a good example of a very technically focused project that we have. Ada Camp is a good example of a community, although we were trying very hard to produce tangible output. So, Gender Gap, yeah. They want to improve the ease of editing Wikipedia. There's a lot of technical, how do we organize things inside of Wikipedia and changes like that. And then there's also just socializing with each other. So, okay, there we go. Great UI. Okay, so this is actually the breadth of topic or the narrowness of focus has actually turned out to be a very interesting factor for the survival of groups, depending on other factors as well. So things like the language-specific workshops are clearly very focused on specific technical areas. GNOME Women's Outreach Program. Linux Chicks has always been a little all over the place, teaching stuff on languages and very different languages and different things to do on Linux, stuff like that. Yeah, I don't really know what to say about Gender Gap there. Ada Initiative, yes, this is broad over here underneath Girl Geek Dinner. So Girl Geek Dinner is just geek, that's it. Geek Feminism, again, geek. Ada Initiative, where we are focusing, if you can call it that, on open technology and culture. So.
One of the One of the interesting things I think about geek feminism is that it kind of blew right off the right side of this thing, saying, okay, anything geek, we're going to apply feminism to.
Right.
And it's been very successful at doing that, and then that invites, people saying, well, why wasn't this done sooner? Traditionally, stuff has sort of been at least cut off at the boundaries of what you would consider to be Linux or similar things like that, or Sisters, what you would consider to be the bounds of systems engineering.
Right, computer science or something. Yeah, and I find that with things like, one of the great things about working in the AID initiative is I'm finding about stuff like feminist activism in comics. There's like cool stuff going on in the comic book world. And yeah, I'm excited that I know about it. So
what we have here is a two-way diagram where we've got broadly focused groups at the top, tightly focused groups at the bottom, over on the left, community focused, and over on the right, technical focused. And so what we wanted to point out here is the gaps in this where it's difficult to found a successful women's group. So if you, down on the bottom left, we have groups that are primarily focused on creating community between women, but that are also very narrowly focused, which Val has labelled the Valley of Death. So things like the original incarnation of Gnome Women, which was simply a mailing list for women in Gnome. This was before they grew a mentoring project. I want to avoid unfortunate metaphors involving birth and death and so forth, but it never really launched. The mailing list existed and nobody knew what to do with it. Debian Women was more successful for a while and slowly died off. It's difficult to bring people together within a small group where there's a very small number of women, and then the only thing you do is talk about womenness or similar things. You can talk about womenness quite a lot, as the Geek Feminism blog up the top of Broad proves, with its sort of 500 odd posts and the wiki with its 666 pages. There's a lot to talk about, but it's very difficult if you confine yourself to women in Debian or women in GNOME or similar kind of scopes. So that was a very popular kind of project to launch in around about 2003, 2004, and some of those projects are still continuing, Ubuntu Women, for example. But it's a difficult space to found a group in, and so one of our recommendations, we think, is that if you're going to found a group to do with bringing women together and creating social bonds between women, that you don't tie it extremely closely to a topic along the lines of, this group is only for women who are into Arduino, or similar. And then up on the top right, groups that are broad and extremely technical are unusual because it's just hard to do that. In the sense of we're going to talk almost entirely about technical things, but it can be any technical thing. Admittedly, I am actually trying to found a project in that space, but at the, it's empty for a reason. Most groups who are doing technical work tend to do technical work on a similar thing, unsurprisingly, because otherwise you have no common language.
Yeah, so we thought this was interesting. We wanted to find patterns of what works and what doesn't work so that we could help people understand if they're putting their effort into something, where to direct it. For example. So, why would you want to start a Women in Open Technology and Culture group? There's networking, just getting to meet each other. There's having a safe space. It's important to. It's difficult to understand if you haven't been there, but just having a place where you feel normal is really helpful to recruiting and retaining women in this space as well. And plus, it just ends up being a whole lot of fun. Like Ada Camp was just really enjoyable. Girl Geek dinners are really fun.
Selena brought up an interesting point in a panel at Hakeson, and her point was that if you allow people, not all women by all means identify really strongly with women as an identity, but a lot do. So women's groups aren't for everyone, for every woman for that reason. Right. However, if you allow people who have a strong identification within your subculture to retain that identification, it actually improves their engagement with the broader culture. So, and this is an argument put in Unlocking the Clubhouse, which is a book about women in computer science. And so the argument here is that by allowing women to create a space where they can, maintain and share their identity as women actually increases their engagement and identification with the surrounding culture as well.
Yeah, there's a fear that creating the women's group will separate the women out from the main project, and you'll never see them again. It's quite the opposite. A lot of us wouldn't be here without something like Linux Chicks. All right, so there's some very, very important, here's some lessons we've learned through lots of experience about what to do and what not to do when starting a women's group. So the first one is please try not to. Please try to go join in an existing one. I don't know if it's something about the culture of open technology and culture where we're all off doing our own thing and ready to start new stuff all of the time, but it's a lot of us want to go start our own thing. Just go find something that exists and you'll be a lot happier in general. But if you do,
the people who started our entire nonprofit last year.
We're filling an unfilled space. We spent a lot of time figuring out what was not there. So if you're a man, don't think about it, please. So there's this great phrase in the general field of, do you want to?
So the phrase "nothing about us without us" originates in Central European foreign policy in the 1980s, apparently. And was picked up by the disability activist community in particular. So nothing about us without us in the sense of, in the disability space, that's that you don't build resources without, or communities for disabled people on their behalf. Likewise, it's best not to, for various reasons, build communities for women on their behalf.
Don't expect women to start a group. If a woman shows up at your local whatever something group or on your mailing list, don't be like, oh, hey, we really wanted someone to start a women's group. It's a great way to scare her off. Find 3 more women to found it together. These things, if you're doing this as a volunteer thing, real life is going to happen. You need backups. And if you can't find 3 women to do it, probably it's not ready yet to start a group. On naming, it's very simple, just use women. Don't use girls, don't use chicks, don't use ladies. I know this is all tempting, we all hate the word women. It's like got all these like woman nasty vibes, whatever, but it's actually the best word out there and the least insulting, the most respectful. So we recommend going broad instead of narrow on topic, unless you're doing something like a workshop that's very specifically focused on something like teaching Python. No, it's fine, I think, yes. Okay, have clear defined goals and scope. This is very important. Linux Chicks was kind of an off-the-cuff thing founded by this wonderful person, Deb Richardson. At one point she said offhandedly, the only rule is be polite, be helpful. This turned into like our text, our founding document. It was amazing what people could get out of these 4 words, and it included things like, no, we can't run off trolls, except unless we do it politely, that sort of thing. So it's good to have a written down goal for your group, or else you're going to find people with different ideas.
A lot of these here start small, consider a one-off event rather than an ongoing group, as in consider having a women's, at your hackerspace, say, consider having a women's dinner rather than, let's have a women's dinner every month and call it the women's group.
Yeah.
A lot of these are very similar to any group founding thing. Start small, build on what you've started, have something that you can gracefully abandon if nobody at all is interested. Partly it's because it's a little depressing to find all of these, just saddening to find these groups that are just sort of a wasteland. Somebody keeps paying for the domain name, but that's all that they're doing. Whereas if all you've promised to do is hold a women's dinner, it's a success as soon as you've all eaten. Yeah.
An important thing here is be prepared to moderate any public forums you create. Probably the best advice we got from the ADA initiative is from Selena Deckelman. Hey, Selena. Who said, don't have a public mailing list. We do have one, we just have it turned off so most people can't post most of the time. But yeah, just people are going to show up, there's going to be fights about the most insane things. You're never like, why are we having discussion about the Palestinian question on this mailing list? So consider not having one. We don't have to.
So we wanted to talk a little bit. Obviously, there are failure modes that are general to groups, like nobody shows up. The founders have a giant argument with each other. That can happen to any group. There are a few things that are specific to women's groups that we want to warn people about. One that's repeatedly happened is that the group. It certainly happened, and they spoke about it publicly, which is why I can talk about it here. It happened to Debian Women. It started as Debian Women, and for a while it was known as Debian Only People Won't Be Rude to You. And so and it was also because of that, it became known as one of the few places you could find some of the FTP masters. And so then it became Debian Find the FTP masters and Don't Swear, or something along those lines. And so you lose your, you have to even though it can feel very aggressive and it can cause its own arguments, you have to be quite aggressive in defending its status as a women's place, focused on women's experience and voices, against it's the place where people aren't mean to each other.
Okay. How much time do we have for questions?
6 minutes.
6 minutes? Okay, cool. We'll put the slides up. We made them complete enough that you could actually understand them without, so.
Yes, we'll turn the last few slides into blog entries. They're more specifically about what you can do to found a women in technology group, which would be a good thing to write up for our blog. Finally, we do want to say that we are brought to you by the ADA Initiative, and in particular by donations to the ADA Initiative. You can donate at supportada.org/donate. In particular, if you donate in Australian local time, East Coast local time by 7 p.m. Friday, Ceph, which is an American company spun off from DreamHost, will be matching all donations dollar for dollar up to $3,000. And there's plenty of those $3,000 left. So the next couple of days are a good time to donate.
All right, thank you very much, Valerie and Mary. Round of applause, please. As mentioned, we do have some time for questions, and it is probably best if people come down the front, so it's a bit easier for all concerned.
Hey, I guess I got a little bit of info and some questions. I'm assuming that you probably didn't cover all the groups because you didn't have enough time, because there's a lot more other groups there, like Drupal Chicks and that, for example, that's very technical focused and has been running for a long time. One thing that's been concerning me as a woman that's been in IT and technology for my whole entire existence, and always worked with Linux and open source stuff, I'm finding that there's more and more women that are coming up to me and actually saying to me that it's the women that they're starting to feel a bit alienated by, whether it be from an elitist attitude or whether it be from not, coming up to a woman and, going to a woman at a conference, hi, you're a new woman. My name's Mary, I've been doing Linux for X amount, etc. What are your feelings towards that? It's just something I've noticed a lot more, and as I said, I've had a lot more women kind of coming up to me and saying, we'd like to get more involved, but we're not feeling the exclusion from the men, we're actually feeling it from some of the women.
I guess my initial thought is that so one potential downside of these groups is that you do end up with people who know each other quite well. And so you can end up with a bunch of women who've known each other for 10 years and thus have the same kind of mild hostility or in-groupiness to outsiders as any group that's known each other for 10 years can have. So in particular, last year there was, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, there's an in-joke at this conference about calling women unicorns, which has caused some of the women to start jokingly self-identifying as unicorns and wearing unicorn badges and so forth. And women who weren't aware of the in-joke heard about it and believed that the conference was handing women unicorn stickers and referring to them as unicorns, and were extremely put off by it. So I think it's a risk of it's probably a more in the category of general failure modes, but that if you create a group of people who self-identify as part of that group, that they do develop a mild, or in some cases extreme, pushback on outsiders.
I also like to say that women are just as likely to be shy and socially inept as men. It is difficult to be expected to be the welcome wagon all the time, every day, no matter how you feel.
It is, it's hard, but it makes a really big difference.
It's true, but I don't think that.
I still try to make that, especially, you know what I mean?
Right. It's true, but
That really helps people.
this sort of comes back to the women's group becomes known as Debian except nice to you sort of thing. So every woman is supposed to be, someone at a conference except nice to you. So perhaps, having expectations that everybody has a bad day is helpful. Another question?
You said this a bit about Linux chicks, but I'm wondering how many of the current groups do you feel it's just one or two people are doing 90% of it, and they're quite vulnerable to those people dropping out and the whole group folding up?
I don't particularly want to name names, but it's pretty easy if you go and look at mailing lists to figure out the level of activity, stuff like that. So,
So is there a way to sort of counter that or something?
So one of the things that seems particularly helpful is, and this is an ongoing theme with the ADA initiative, and people who follow us won't be surprised, but making it part of people's job does improve things. So for example, to take a non-ADA initiative example, the GNOME Women's Outreach Project, we don't know completely about all of their mentors, but a lot of their mentors are doing it on company time. And that does mean that certainly Marina is the project's leader and does a great deal of their outreach and publicity and mentor assignment work, but that there is this solid base of people underneath who are active within the project, and that there's a structure they can work in where it's not very vulnerable to them getting their first ever job, for example, whereas volunteer projects do have that vulnerability.
we're also curious to see if people think that it might be time to do a broad focus group that includes all of these various little project-specific groups and makes a social group, where it's sort of like geek feminism, but explicitly this is for community and hanging out, not for activism. It's an interesting question whether that would work or not, but it's something we're asking around about.
Hi, I'm a man. What can I do to help apart from just listening and try to be friendly? And donating?
Let's see. Yeah, there we go. All right. Listen, don't dominate discussion, speak up to support in mainstream forums, don't show up just to hang out, don't come unless invited, publicize the group, help get funding, and read the Geek Feminism Wiki. So. So this is an interesting thing where you're trying to get a room full of women so that you don't feel strange, and if you end up with a room full of men, it's just the same as usual. So check to see. But there's this interesting problem where
in particular, some of these groups declare themselves women only, and in that particular case, certainly, and men do show up and then have arguments about the women's only status. So that applies particularly in the case. There are some groups that advertise men are welcome or men are welcome in some capacities, in which case you can consider whether you can join in that capacity.
That's the invitation saying, men are welcome, blah, blah, blah. There's an interesting thing where often a women's group does want men to come and does not think to specify that. So and then you end up with a bunch of men who are sensitive to the issues and think, oh yes, well women probably want to hang out with each other for once. And they don't show up, and then there are the men who are like, hey, a thing, I will come and speak loudly the entire time, and they do show up. So just try to consider whether or not this is appropriate for you.
And it also, in places like open source, where women are an extreme minority, it is possible to end up with a women's group that is 80 to 90% men. And in that case, it's simply when new women join, if they were, presumably they're joining because they wanted to be in a women's group, they simply don't find one other than in name. So that's part of...
You join the IRC
yeah.
channel and it's like 90% Ben and David, you know, and you're like, oh.
Yeah, I haven't joined many new groups this year because I'm trying to find, trying to finish my PhD and also working for the ADA initiative. But for example, I joined the IRC of a new group which was specifically labelled a women's group, and I didn't see a woman speak for 3 hours, and there was a lot of talking. So that's sort of, when we say don't come unless invited, don't show up just to hang out, we're talking about that as the background, having groups that are women's groups purely in name only. All
right, I think we're just gone over time, so please again give your thanks to Valerie and Mary, and we do have a little gift on behalf of Linux Conference Australia. You get your little cards. And we have just one to share. It's a gold-plated glass penguin, and it's not an invisible pink unicorn. Thank you very much.